The Appalachian cold bit right through Cletus' flannel shirt. He sat dead still in his tree stand, a mason jar of unaged white lightning moonshine resting on his thigh. Had been tracking that 12-point buck for 3 damn days, and the prize had finally sauntered into the clearing. Just as Cletus raised his Remington 700, the air in the clearing warped violently, like a desert mirage. A dead, silent, geometric craft flickered into existence for a split second, dropping a slender, nearly invisible silhouette into the brush. The buck spooked and bolted. Cletus didn't flinch, he just ground his jaw. Down at the base of the oak, his old bloodhound, Buster, let out a low rumble, that deep chest, vibrating growl that meant something deeply unnatural had just trespassed in their woods. Cletus watched the frost on the ground get crushed by invisible boots. That sure as hell wasn't no bear, 'cause bears don't bend light. Cletus took a slow throat, burning swig of the shine, the liquid fire warming his chest. He lowered his rifle and slid a massive Bowie knife from his belt. "Well, old buddy," Cletus whispered to the hound, his eyes locked on that faint distortion in the air, calculating with the cold, hard survival instincts of a family that had worked these mountains for 200 years. "Looks like venison ain't on the menu tonight. We're bagging ourselves some exotic game." The words had barely left his mouth before Cletus was out of the stand. Rough oak bark tore at his flannel sleeves as he dropped like a rock off a glacier, landing completely silent in the dirt just 3 paces from the warped air. Boots crunching the thin frost, Cletus flicked his wrist and hurled the full mason jar of white lightning straight at the invisible scout's feet. The heavy glass shattered into shrapnel, and the 190 proof liquid fanned out in a wide spray. It bypassed the alien's energy shield gaps entirely, dousing its chest, mounted cloaking generator, and seeping deep into the armor joints down half its body. Cletus whipped out his beat, up Zippo, flicked the wheel with a sharp clack, and a bright yellow flame sprang up. He didn't even bother aiming. He just tossed the lit lighter straight into the alcohol, misted air. Whoomp! A roaring ball of blue-red fire erupted. The high-octane flames raced up the invisible silhouette in a heartbeat. The plastic housing of the cloaking module melted instantly, spitting out the acrid stench of fried copper. The bent light snapped back to reality, revealing an Imperial scout in slick, gray, high-tech armor, completely exposed. The thermal optics on its helmet warped from the heat, shrieking a panicked warning alarm. The scout let out a piercing, digitized shriek. Nothing in its elite Imperial training had prepared it for an attack this primitive. Energy shields stopped bullets and plasma, but they didn't do jack against a splash of hillbilly firewater. It flailed its activated plasma blade, the glowing blue edge hacking blindly at the tree trunks. The thermal display was completely blinded by the roaring fire, drowning the HUD in static. The scout stumbled backward over broken glass, armored boots trampling burning moonshine, until its back slammed hard against the oak trunk. Down below, old Buster's muscles coiled tight. His claws dug into the frozen mud and dead leaves, fangs bared, his low growl peaking into a snarl. The hound was strung tighter than a recurve bow, waiting for that exact moment to snap. Buster launched like buckshot out of a 12-gauge. 120 pounds of pure hound, reeking of pine sap and raw iron, smashed through the superheated air. The decloaked Imperial scout swung its plasma blade in a panicked frenzy. The melted camo module smoked on its arm, and the thermal visor was totally useless. Just as the blue blade sheared off a chunk of oak bark, Buster's fangs sank deep into the unarmored joint of the alien's thigh. Canine teeth punched through the synthetic muscle and crushed the femoral tendon. The alien scout screamed, a sound so piercing it shook the snow off the branches. The plasma blade slipped from its grip, hit the mud, and powered down with a dying hum. Cletus stepped out from behind the tree, his boots crushing embers without making a sound. He didn't bother drawing his gun. He just drove a mud-caked hiking boot right into the seam of the scout's rib armor. The flimsy, high-tech plating cracked open, and the 7-foot scout crashed face first into the moss, its energy shield buzzing and overloading. Without a sliver of hesitation, Cletus drove his Bowie knife up under the scout's exposed jawline. The blade pierced straight through the metal, reinforced spine, and out the throat. Dark green blood sprayed all over Cletus' pant leg. The scout kicked twice, then went dead still. He crouched, grabbed the scout's twitching wrist, and wrenched the wrist, mounted plasma blade free. He weighed the alien tech in his hand and spat. Fancy piece of plastic. Ain't even balanced right for choppin' kindling. Buster let go of the alien, shook the green blood off his jowls, and nudged Cletus' leg for a reward. Cletus pulled out a chunk of raw liverhead carved off a buck earlier, tossed it to the hound, stood up, and wiped the ash from his face. Right then, a weird, low-frequency hum echoed from the sky. The pine needles underfoot began to vibrate, shaking the snow from the canopy. Buster pressed his head against Cletus' leg, his black nose twitching at the cold wind. A deep rumble rolled up his throat. 3 strange scents, mixed with the sharp ozone stink of cold metal, were moving in from the canopy drop zone. Cletus didn't say a word. He waded straight into a half-frozen mud bog by the trail. The freezing sludge swallowed him up to his calves, the ice shards slicing at his ankles, but he didn't stop. He rolled in the muck, his massive rough hands violently packing ice, cold mud onto his face, his clothes down his collar, into his stubble, and inside his boots. In seconds, his core temperature plummeted to match the frozen roots around him, dropping perfectly below the imperial thermal recognition threshold. He slapped a layer of mud over the captured plasma blade, dimming its blue glow until it looked like a chunk of frozen scrap iron glued to his forearm. He crouched low in the tangled shadows of the old oak's roots. He backhanded a layer of mud over Buster's head and neck, pressing the dog flat to the ground. Gripping his Bowie knife tight against the trunk, Cletus held his breath. 3 pairs of cloaked boots crunched over the snow. The Imperial Vanguard hunters swept the area with thermals, but all they found was the cooling corpse of their scout. Not a single human heat signature registered on their HUDs. The footsteps crept closer, pushing through the low brush. The lead hunter's boot hovered right over a patch of loose dirt hidden by pine needles. The black rubber sole was less than half an inch from a rusty, spring-loaded bear trap Cletus had buried 6 months ago to catch a 300-pound black bear. Loose dirt dusted down through the boot's treads. The boot dropped that last half-inch, planting firmly onto the trigger pan. The carbon steel spring, dormant for 4 months, let out a dry, rusty clack. The massive waist-high jaws snapped shut with brutal mechanical force, taking a chunk of frozen mud and roots with it. Cletus built these things for big game. The serrated steel teeth carried a blood groove and packed enough hardness and torque to snap a thick oak trunk clean in half. The pale blue personal energy shield rippled uselessly. High-tech force fields ain't worth a damn against pure primitive mechanical bite. The steel teeth punched right through the armor, shattering the right tibia and knee joint. Bone fragments ripped through the suit's underlay, and blue-green alien blood instantly soaked the frozen earth. The warped air violently snapped back to reality. The Vanguard hunter was forced out of cloak, gray-blue armor plastered in black mud. Its thermal visor was knocked askew. The alien didn't even process what had hit it. A shrill, panicked scream shattered the forest's silence. The alien frantically pulled the plasma blade from its lower back, hacking blindly at the bushes, while its other hand desperately punched its comms to call for backup. The other 2 invisible hunters instantly locked up, swinging their thermals back and forth. But the woods were freezing cold. No heat signatures. Just the agonizing screams of their comrade. Cletus was pressed so hard against the tree his back muscles ached. His right hand rested on the hilt of his stolen plasma blade, freezing mud dripping from his elbow. His weight shifted to the balls of his feet, waiting for the screaming idiot to draw every ounce of attention from the other 2, but the 2 hunters hesitated. They heard the screams, but they couldn't find the predator. The staticky bursts over their comms frayed their nerves, their invisible boots shuffling anxiously, afraid to push forward. The moment one hunter moved downslope toward the creek, and the other circled upwind to check for tracks, Cletus moved. He slipped out of the brush like a landslide, silent and lethal. The snap of twigs under his boots was completely drowned out by the alien's shrieking. The trapped hunter dropped its weapon, using both hands to desperately pry the steel jaws off its leg. The blue blade sparked against the carbon steel, but the bear trap didn't give an inch. The alien was so focused on the iron trap it never heard the wind shift behind it. Cletus swung his arm in a brutal horizontal arc. The stolen plasma blade carved a clean line of blue light, slicing through the hardened imperial neck collar like a hot knife through butter. The gray-purple head rolled into the dead leaves, momentum carrying it forward. Purple blood blasted from the stump, painting Cletus' chest. He dropped to a crouch, sliced the mounting strap off the dead alien's waist, and grabbed the still, warm, personal cloaking generator. Just as he stood, he heard the familiar patter of paws. Old Buster trotted up, tail wagging, his floppy ears swiveling like radar dishes, locking onto the two panicked hunters thrashing through the woods. Cletus thumbed the activation latch on the side of the device. With a soft click, the latch popped, and a pale blue glow crawled over the alien tech. Using some tanned leather strips from his belt, Cletus' caked fingers quickly lashed the square box to Buster's collar. Buster's gray-brown ears perked right up. His wet black nose twitched toward the thicket, drool hitting the frozen mud. He had already locked onto the remaining vanguard hunters. Seconds later, the cloaking field expanded, blurring the hound's muscular frame into the shadows until there was nothing left but the faint, terrifying crunch of paws on dead twigs. "Go get 'em, boy," Cletus rasped, his voice grinding like gravel, scratching the empty air where his dog's chin used to be. Buster let out a low whine and bolted into the mud like a furry missile. The next second, a barrage of rabid, echoing barks exploded through the dense timber. The two cloaked imperial hunters froze tight, fingers wrapping around the triggers of their plasma rifles. Their thermals swept the area, nothing but sub-zero bark and frozen dirt. Buster had rolled in the ice bog with Cletus. His body heat was sealed tight, and the cloak hid his visual profile entirely. The barking bounced from the left canopy to the right brush. Dead leaves rained down as an invisible force slammed into the trunks. The hunter on the left panicked, dumping a volley of plasma into the tree line. The blue-purple bolts sheared an oak branch in half, starting a fire that the damp air quickly choked into black smoke. The hunters' back formation scattered. They backed away from each other, leaving a 15-yard gap and exposing their blind spots, their panicked breathing flooding the tactical comms. Cletus leaned against the base of the ancient oak, the frozen mud on his back scraping the bark. He slowly reached behind him. His knuckles brushed the freezing walnut stock of his Remington 700. His finger traced the worn trigger guard. He brought the crosshairs up, smoothly tracking a faint, rippling distortion in the air that only a seasoned mountain hunter could spot, the slipstream created when the invisible Buster forced the imperial hunter into a hasty retreat. The freezing mountain wind bit his mud-caked cheek, carrying the scent of pine and moonshine. He held his breath, and his fingertips steadily squeezed the trigger. The shoulder, numbing recoil, and the crack of the rifle shattered the forest silence. The .308 Winchester round ripped through the cold air, screaming across the 10-yard gap and slamming into the invisible hard target. A sharp crack of shattering tech exploded as the hunter's cloak dropped, revealing matte gray armor stamped with the imperial crest. The ballistic helmet's visor blew out in a shower of crystal and crimson brain matter, mixed with bright blue alien blood splattered the oak trunk. The massive 7-foot body swayed, then crashed stiff as a board into the knee, deep rot of the forest floor. A fist, Sized oval chunk of cold metal popped loose from its belt, rolling down the slope and stopping against a mossy limestone rock, a pristine, high explosive plasma grenade. The last vanguard hunter completely lost its mind. Its thermal scanner swept the woods, painting nothing but cold, lifeless environment. It couldn't find the damn low-tech hillbilly. The invisible hound was circling it, barks echoing from every direction, claws squeaking against the wet mud. The alien didn't know where the dog was, let alone the hidden sniper. It aggressively retracted its plasma blade and gripped its energy rifle with white-knuckle desperation. The alien clamped down on the trigger. A storm of blue-white plasma bolts tore through the oak grove. The fire stripped the bark off thick trunks, sending flaming wood chips flying. The stench of burning plastic and scorched timber filled the entire woods. Cletus laid flat in a frozen muck trench, knuckles white from the cold but dead still. He deliberately exposed just the tip of the Remington's barrel past the brush. The invisible buster let out a low bark right at the hunter's feet, kicking up some leaves. The hunter snapped, spinning its rifle and dumping half a mag into the leaf pile. Cletus took the shot. The lead round grazed the alien's energy shield and sparked off the granite, sending a spray of stone shrapnel rattling against the armor. Having baited the hook, Cletus turned and bolted. His heavy leather boots slapped loudly against the frozen mud, making damn sure the alien heard every step. He sprinted down the ravine, heading straight for his hidden moonshine, still tucked against the cliff wall. The last hunter had been pushed to the brink by the phantom slaughter of its squad. Cloak was useless. Thermals were useless. Everything was an invisible trap. Finally seeing a tangible target, it gave chase without a second thought. Plasma bursts zipped past Cletus' back, blasting smoking craters into the canyon wall. Just around the bend was the cave entrance. A biting river wind blew from the mouth, carrying the heavy, sweet, and sour stench of unfermented mash. Cletus ducked inside, weaving through the neat rows of oak fermentation barrels, and pressed himself flat against the icy rock wall near the frozen river. His left hand wrapped around the stolen high-explosive plasma grenade, his thumb hooked on the pin, fingers tracing the cold metal shell. The footsteps outside grew heavier. The vanguard hunter's cloaking signal flickered and failed, the sheer amount of freezing mud on its legs ruining the optics. It stomped into the cave, energy rifle raised, the black muzzle sweeping over the massive, neatly arranged barrels of high-proof alcohol. The sickly sweet eye-watering scent of raw ethanol leaked heavily from the wood seams. The hunter's thermal screen was pure static. The cave was a literal icebox, and Cletus, covered in frozen mud, blended perfectly with the rock face. The alien growled a garbled curse into its comms, its boots creaking on the pine floorboards as it stepped deeper into the dead, end corner formed by the barrels. Cletus flashed a grin, showing off smoke, stained yellow teeth. With a flick of his wrist, he yanked the pin and bounced the grenade off the rock wall, dropping it dead center into the most over-filled barrel of undistilled shine. A hollow thunk echoed in the vat. Cletus didn't stick around. He turned, ducked low, and sprinted out of the cave entrance without missing a beat, diving headfirst into the half-frozen river below. The freezing water swallowed him whole. He grabbed onto a submerged rock to anchor himself, leaving only the tip of his nose above the surface to breathe. Less than 10 seconds later, a blinding crimson flash blew the cave wide open. The entire cliff face shuddered. A shockwave of blistering heat, splintered oak and scorched armor plating blasted into the sky. Half the cave entrance collapsed. The vaporized alcohol ignited in a thermobaric fireball, turning everything inside to ash. The vanguard hunter didn't even have time to scream. Cletus waited for the shockwave to pass. He hauled his freezing ass up the rocky riverbank, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. Old Buster shook a coat of ice water off himself, the invisible generator buzzing faintly on his collar. Only Cletus could reach out and pat the dog's head, guided entirely by that familiar, wet hound smell. Far off in the timber, the deafening roar of thrusters rattled the frozen earth beneath his boots, every vibration slamming directly into his chest. Cletus wiped the melting ice water from his face. He patted the rough wood stock of his Remington, felt the icy bite of the plasma blade on his hip, and pressed against the hard oil, paper, wrapped pouch of dry tobacco digging into his hip bone. He crouched low into the shadows of the oak roots. The half-dried mud on his back and pants was covered in frost, locking in his body heat perfectly, more than enough to beat a mass, produced thermal sweep. A ghostly blue floodlight pierced the canopy. 100-ton heavy assault dropship slammed down in a clearing half a mile away, throwing dirt and snow dozens of feet into the air and spooking a flock of grouse into the sky. The massive alloy ramp hissed open. 2 40-foot-tall bipedal mechs stepped out, their gleaming alloy feet crushing the permafrost, sending spiderweb cracks through the ground with every step. Twin heavy cannons swiveled on their mounts, infrared lenses sweeping the woods, painting the oak trunks in a glaring red grid. A cold, synthetic voice boomed from the dropship's external PA, dripping with the arrogant superiority of an imperial commander. To the primitive who slaughtered my vanguard, step into the clearing and surrender. I will leave your corpse intact and grant your savage tribe an extra 3 standard days to live. Cletus stayed squatted by the roots. He casually tore open his oil paper, pinched a massive wad of dry tobacco and jammed it into his cheek. The bitter juice slid down his throat, sending a shiver down his spine. He narrowed his gray-blue eyes, watching the mechs slowly lumber toward the ruins of his moonshine still. His gaze drifted past the splintered oak debris and landed on a heavy steel logging cable and a rusty pulley, half buried in the soot and ash. He spat a stream of dark tobacco juice and tightened his grip on the Bowie knife's bone handle. He gave Buster a subtle stay gesture, then moved like a ghost up the ridge toward a grove of century-old oaks. Down below, Buster sat invisible at the crossroad, hidden in the mist. The only telltale sign was a pair of glowing hound eyes shifting in the fog, his tail giving a soft thump for Cletus. The targets were moving in. The blasted ruins of the still had exactly what he needed. 2 heavy-duty logging pulleys buried in the mud, and a thick, inch-wide steel cable coiled around a snapped hemlock, tools left over from hauling a massive 1,000-year maple last month. Unscathed by the blast, Cletus crouched under the thickest branch of the giant oak, dug the frozen dirt out from the roots with his knife, and locked the first pulley onto the branch extending over the trail. He anchored the second in a granite crevice at the bottom of the slope. He threaded the heavy steel cable through the pulleys, wrapping one end tight around that 3-ton maple log hidden under a pile of deadwood in the pit. He pulled the other end taut and tied it off to a fixed stump at the oak's base. The rusty barbs tore at his palms, turning his skin black and raw, but he didn't even flinch. He yanked the cable. The pulley let out a dull creak. The massive log hung suspended under its deadwood camouflage. One swing of an axe, and that log would ride the downslope gravity like a wrecking ball straight into the mech's path. He grabbed a few handfuls of icy mud and slathered it over the log and cable, sealing in what little heat he had transferred. To the Imperial thermals, it was just another cold, dead rock in the woods. The ground began to shake. Through the wet fog, 2 sweeping searchlights pierced the darkness. The earth, shattering thuds of the mechs, knocked leaves from the canopy, their thermal scanners buzzing so loud he could hear them half a mile out. The commander's stiff broadcast echoed from the dropship, "Commence carpet sweep. The primitive's heat signature cannot hide." Cletus stepped back behind the giant oak, pulled the Remington 700 tight into his shoulder, and let the crosshairs settle on the looming cold metal silhouettes. His finger rested on the trigger. The freezing mud stuck under his fingernails made the blued steel trigger slippery. The mountain breeze, thick with pine sap, swept across his hunting platform. Below him, the invisible Buster let out a low whine. The mechs were so close, the rock face was trembling, shaking the wad of chew right in Cletus' jaw. He pulled the trigger. The rifle cracked, and the bullet slammed dead into the lead mech's chest plate. A shower of sparks erupted. The lead slug merely chipped the paint, penetrating absolutely nothing, but it was more than enough to piss off the Imperial Marine inside. Both mech turrets snapped toward the tree line, hydraulic joints hissing and whining. The massive metal feet snapped pine trees like toothpicks as they charged straight up the bullet's trajectory directly into the kill zone. Red laser sights danced across the oak trunks, the heat making the bark sizzle and pop. Cletus leaned his rifle against the wooden stand and slid down the trunk. His rough boots hit the frozen mud, slamming on the brakes. His right hand immediately grabbed the axe handle, holding the trap line. The steel cable held 3 tons of waterlogged, winter-frozen fur, heavy enough to crush a bear's spine. The lead mech stepped squarely into the center of the trap's depression, its turrets blindly blasting the spot Cletus had just fired from, spraying plasma and pine splinters everywhere. It completely ignored the massive deadweight swinging right above it. Cletus torqued his wrist, bringing the sharp axe blade down on the pine, tar-soaked hemp rope. The line snapped instantly. The steel cable shrieked under the immense tension. Guided by the pulley, several tons of frozen fur and jagged burls swung down the slope like a medieval mace, slamming dead center into the lead mech's cockpit. The reinforced ballistic glass shattered into confetti. The hardened alloy hull crumpled like wet cardboard, the internal framework snapping with a sickening crunch. Green hydraulic fluid mixed with blue pilot blood sprayed across the snow, painting the frozen mud in twisted, alien colors. The dead mech slumped into the dirt, its misfiring lasers slicing through half an oak tree before the massive trunk crashed down onto its rear cannons, sending up plumes of thick black smoke. Cletus wiped the mud splatter from his face, wiped the hemp fibers off his knife onto his canvas pants, and gripped the alien blood, stained plasma blade strapped to his thigh. He coiled his legs and launched himself forward. His mud-caked canvas boots kicked off the shattered armor plating as he vaulted like a buckshot pellet toward the smoking wreck of the lead mech. Behind him, the second mech roared to life, ground shaking, its plasma cannons swiveling with a mechanical screech. A thermal slug grazed Cletus' shoulder and blew a hole in the oak tree behind him, raining scalding splinters down on his head, but Cletus never even looked back. He lunged at the cracked cockpit hatch, jamming the stolen plasma blade right into the warped steel frame. The blue-white blade sheared through the dense alloy, letting out a deafening, sizzling screech. Molten metal dripped onto his exposed wrist, raising a line of angry red blisters, but he didn't even flinch. He carved straight through the broken chassis, slicing through thick bundles of energy conduits. Blue-purple sparks hit his cheekbones, burning the skin, but he just slapped the smoking wires away. There it was, locked in the heart of the cockpit, a fist-sized energy core glowing with a blinding cold blue aura. He bit down on the plasma blade's hilt, grabbed the core's retaining mounts with 2 mud and blood-stained hands, his knuckles turning white. With a violent grunt, he ripped the entire battery straight out of the socket, snapping 3-thumb, thick power cables in the process. Blue lightning arced up his arm, numbing it to the bone. The battery casing was as cold as mountain ice, weighing his arm down like a brick. The second mech was bearing down on him. Massive metal feet snapped pine trees in half, shaking the mountain as the cannon locked dead onto his back. Cletus pivoted, the vibrating blue core in his hand. His eyes locked through the brush, finding his target half a mile away, the massive, pitch-black engine intake of the grounded dropship. Cletus gritted his teeth, planting his left boot on a piece of scrap metal. He wound his core tight like a heavy bow, and with the throwing arm of a county fair baseball champ, he hurled the blue glowing core with everything he had. The glowing orb whistled through the air, skimming beneath the pine branches, and flew straight into the intake, a perfect strike. Almost simultaneously, the mech behind him fired its heavy plasma cannon. The scorching shrapnel tore across Cletus' left shoulder, ripping away burnt canvas and flesh. He rolled down the embankment into a hollowed-out tree root, his shoulders screaming in pain, but he didn't let out a single groan. He just kept his eyes glued to the dropship. For 3 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. The second mech was already cycling another round. Then, a deep, hollow boom erupted from the dropship's keel. Blue and purple fire belched out of the intakes, chaining through the fuel line straight to the reactor. The massive multi-thousand-ton vessel lurched violently. The landing gear shattered into shrapnel, and the heavy hull slammed sideways into the marshland. Thick black smoke billowed out of the hull breaches, blotting out the setting sun. Behind him, the mech's cannon suddenly died. The power link to the dropship severed, the mech's joints locked up solid, freezing it in place. Inside the cockpit, the Marine frantically slammed the control panels as the alarms wailed like a funeral dirge. Down at the smoking dropship, the blast doors suddenly buckled outward. The warped steel screeched on its hinges as a crack opened up, leaking blinding blue energy light. Cletus gripped his Bowie knife, knuckles stark white. The invisible Buster lay low by his boots, a deep rumble vibrating in his chest. With a massive clang, the blast doors blew open. The Imperial commander stumbled out, clutching a shattered helmet. His energy shield was fizzing violently. His entire left arm was blown to hell, and his right hand gripped a blazing plasma blade. The alien roared with arrogant fury, shaking the oak leaves around him. Inferior carbon, based filth. I will grind your bones too. He didn't get to finish. Cletus uncoiled 10 minutes of pure adrenaline, exploding out of the tree crater from 2 yards away. Covered in mud and blood, he drove a devastating right hook square into the commander's exposed jaw. The arrogant alien's head snapped back, smacking hard against the dropship's hull plating with a hollow thud. Its eyes rolled back, and it dropped like a sack of hammers, out colder than a town drunk after a gallon of moonshine. Cletus leaned against a tree trunk, catching his breath for a solid 30 seconds. He spat out a mouthful of bloody spit, reached around his waist, and pulled out a coil of oil-soaked hemp rope he used for tying up wild hogs. He dragged the 180-pound commander toward the edge of the tree line. Buster wagged his tail and trotted right alongside, occasionally nudging his master's leg. The beat-up Ford pickup was parked on a slant by the dirt road, a black bear skull still strapped to the rear bumper from last year's hunt. Cletus hoisted the Supreme Imperial Commander onto the hood and tied him down tight. He wrapped the rough hemp rope 3 times and cinched it with a hunter's dead knot. The commander's energy shield was still fizzing blue, the tight ropes causing ripples across the force field. Cletus wiped the grime off his face, pulled a crumpled cigarette from his coat, and lit it with his Zippo. He took a deep drag. He climbed into the cracked driver's seat, and Buster hopped in next to him, tongue lolling happily. The old Ford sputtered to life, kicking up a cloud of dust as it rolled down the mountain toward town. Cletus blew a smoke ring, shot a sideways glance at the old hound in the passenger seat, and flashed a grin. See that, old buddy? The $5 grand prize for the town huntin' derby is in the bag. That's enough to buy a whole year's worth of corn mash, and maybe fix that damn leaky roof. At the end of the dirt road, the wooden town welcome sign came into view. The midday sun beat down hard, the alien's blue energy shield glowing intensely on the hood, drawing the shocked gasps of old men working the roadside stands.
Writing this story was an absolute blast, primarily because it served as a wild experiment in extreme contrasts. The HFY humanity? Fuck yeah. Genre usually focuses on humanity building grand space fleets or deploying genetically enhanced super soldiers to conquer the stars. But I couldn't stop asking myself a much more grounded question. What if an elite, arrogant alien vanguard landed right in the backyard of a territorial, fiercely resourceful Appalachian backwoods hunter? Cletus and his loyal hound Buster represent the rawest, grittiest, and most unapologetic form of human survival instinct. I found immense joy in designing the sequences where low-tech pragmatism violently dismantled high-tech arrogance. There was a delicious, dark humor in watching advanced optical cloaking get completely short, circuited by a mason jar of 190 proof white lightning, or a pristine personal energy shield failing miserably to stop the mechanical brutality of a rusty spring-loaded bear trap. This clash wasn't just about weaponry, it was a total mismatch of mindsets. The Imperial forces expected an easily terrified, inferior species. Instead, they got a man who viewed their invasion as nothing more than a noisy interruption to his deer hunt, a problem to be solved with mud, logging cables, and a Winchester. By the time I wrote the ending with Cletus strapping the Supreme Imperial Commander to the hood of his beat-up Ford pickup to win a local hunting derby, I was laughing out loud at my desk. It's a loving tribute to that stubborn, gritty backwoods ingenuity. I hope you enjoyed experiencing this wild, pine-scented, moonshine-fueled ride just as much as I loved writing it.